A team of doctors, including emergency physicians and cardiologists, attempted to resuscitate him.
There is a detail that almost never makes it into the retellings of June 25, 2009. It is not dramatic. It is not the kind of fact that opens a headline. It is simply this: the machine that measures how much oxygen is in a person's blood had been sitting in that bedroom for weeks. Not brought in during an emergency. Not wheeled in when things went wrong. It had been there, quietly, night after night, long before anyone outside that house had any reason to worry. And that single fact, more than any single dose or any single decision, is what makes the last hours of Michael Jackson's life so unsettling. Because it means the danger was never a surprise. Someone had already priced it in. By the time paramedics reached that rented mansion in Holmby Hills, the story that would later be told in courtrooms and headlines was already finished in every way that mattered. What happened between 1 in the morning and noon that day was not a sudden collapse. It was the final version of something that had been repeating, quietly, for weeks. A sequence. A pattern. A private ritual conducted behind a closed bedroom door with no witnesses, no nurses, no monitors switched on, and only one man responsible for watching a body that had stopped responding to ordinary medicine a long time ago. The night began the way it always began. Around 1:30 in the morning, Conrad Murray, the cardiologist paid an extraordinary monthly retainer to serve as Jackson's personal physician during rehearsals for his planned London residency, gave him 10 milligrams of Valium. In an average patient, that dose alone would be enough to bring on sleep within the hour. For Michael Jackson, it barely registered. Years of nightly sedation had pushed his tolerance so far past normal thresholds that medications capable of sedating most people functioned, in his body, as little more than a formality. A ritual first step. Something to get through before the drugs that actually worked were brought out. At 2 in the morning, with no sign of sleep, Murray moved to the next stage. 2 milligrams of lorazepam, delivered directly into the bloodstream through an 4-line. This is not a small intervention. In a hospital, that dose is enough to sedate a patient before a surgical procedure. In a private bedroom, administered by one man with no support staff and no equipment monitoring heart rate or oxygen levels, it did nothing. Jackson remained awake. An hour later, at 3, Murray gave a second dose of the same drug. Same substance, same route, same intention, same result. Nothing. By 5 in the morning, 4 hours into a night that should have ended in sleep long before, Murray reached for something stronger. Midazolam, a faster-acting sedative in the same drug family, known for producing a kind of chemical blackout. Patients given this medication in clinical settings often remember nothing of the period it affects. It is used before surgery precisely because it erases the experience of the procedure. In that bedroom, layered on top of everything already circulating in Jackson's system, it represented a level of central nervous system suppression that any physician working inside a hospital would have flagged as dangerous. And still, incredibly, Jackson did not sleep. At 7:30 in the morning, with daylight now fully in the room, Murray administered a second dose of midazolam. This was the 4th intervention of the night. 4 separate sedatives, 5 separate administrations, stacked one on top of another inside a single body over the course of 6 hours. Toxicologists who later reviewed the case described this combined load as extraordinary. Not extraordinary in a clinical setting with monitoring and backup, but extraordinary anywhere outside one. Each additional drug did not simply add to the sedative effect. It compounded the suppression of the one function that mattered most, the drive to breathe. Jackson was still awake. And so he asked, as he had apparently asked many nights before, for what he called his milk. It wasn't milk. It was propofol, a fast-acting anesthetic meant exclusively for use in operating rooms, where a patient's breathing and heart rhythm are tracked continuously by machines and by a team trained to respond within seconds if something goes wrong. For Michael Jackson, it had become something else entirely, the only substance that reliably produced anything resembling rest. Not sleep. Unconsciousness that looked like sleep from the outside but delivered none of what sleep is actually for. This is the detail that gets lost in most versions of this story, and it matters more than almost anything else. Propofol does not create the neurological cycles that a sleeping brain requires. The deep wave phases, the REM cycles, the biological maintenance that happens only during genuine sleep. A person put under by propofol wakes up having received, in the ways that count, nothing. The body registers hours of stillness. The brain registers almost none of the restoration it was supposed to get. Which means that for weeks, possibly months, during a period when Jackson was rehearsing daily for what was billed as the most demanding tour of his career, he had been waking up every single morning having not actually slept. Not once. People who worked alongside him during that stretch remembered days when he seemed distant, foggy, unreachable in a way that read publicly as exhaustion from overwork. It wasn't overwork. It was a man running on a level of sleep deprivation that some of the physicians who later reviewed his case estimated at close to 2 months, uninterrupted. Some believed it may have stretched even longer. At 10:40 that morning, Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol, mixed with a small amount of lidocaine to dull the burning sensation the anesthetic causes when injected undiluted. A strange, almost domestic detail, a surgical drug softened for repeated bedroom use like a routine home remedy. That 25 milligram figure, however, is one of the most contested numbers in the entire case. Forensic toxicologists who examined the propofol concentration found in Jackson's blood after death testified that the levels were inconsistent with a single small dose that had simply been left to metabolize. The numbers pointed instead to something larger, or something ongoing, a continuous drip rather than a one-time injection. What happened in the minutes after that final dose is the part of this story that has been argued over more fiercely than any other. Murray's own account was that he monitored Jackson for roughly 10 minutes and then briefly left the room. He said he was gone only a short time. He said that when he returned, Jackson was no longer breathing. Phone records introduced at trial tell a different story about that window of time. Not about whether Jackson stopped breathing, but about what Murray was doing while it happened. During the exact stretch when a man had just been given a surgical anesthetic with no pulse monitor attached, no oxygen sensor running, no equipment tracking his vital signs in any form, Conrad Murray was on his phone. Calls placed. Calls received. Messages exchanged. One call, prosecutors noted, went to a woman in Las Vegas. None of it had anything to do with the unconscious man in the next room. The records don't just show a gap in supervision. They show what filled it. And medical experts at trial were direct about what that gap meant. Given how propofol suppresses breathing and given that nobody was watching to catch the moment it happened, the outcome that followed had become, in their words, essentially inevitable. When Murray came back into the room and found Jackson unresponsive, what he did next, and, just as importantly, what he did not do, became the most bitterly contested sequence in the entire case. He did not call emergency services. He began CPR himself, directly on the bed, rather than moving Jackson to the floor first. That single choice matters more than it sounds like it should. A mattress absorbs the force of chest compressions instead of transferring it into the body, meaning much of what should have been driving blood toward Jackson's heart and brain was instead being swallowed by the bed beneath him. Rather than dialing 911, Murray called for help inside the house. Medication was reportedly moved. It was eventually a member of the household staff, not Murray, who placed the actual emergency call at 12:21 in the afternoon. The exact length of time between Murray discovering Jackson unresponsive and that call being made has never been fully settled, and it likely never will be, because the one piece of evidence that might have answered the question no longer exists. The property security system recorded continuously on a loop, automatically overwriting older footage to make room for new. In the early hours after Jackson's death, before anyone treated the scene as a potential homicide, only a short clip was preserved, a few minutes showing Jackson arriving at the house. The hours that actually mattered, the hours covering the morning in question, were erased by the system's own automated cycle before investigators thought to secure them. Whatever those cameras captured is simply gone. Nobody will ever know what they would have shown. Paramedics arrived at 12:26. They found no pulse. No spontaneous breathing. Murray told them a pulse had been present only moments earlier. The paramedics' own documentation said otherwise. No pulse, and no change in Jackson's condition at any point they observed. Based on the physical signs in front of them, they assessed that CPR had likely been underway for far longer than would leave any realistic chance of recovery. They continued anyway, for roughly 42 minutes at the house and continuously during the drive to the hospital. At Ronald Reagan Ucla Medical Center, emergency physicians kept working for more than 2 hours. Every intervention available to them was used. At 2:26 in the afternoon, Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. The cause was acute propofol intoxication. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, not in the everyday sense the word implies, but in its precise legal meaning. The fatal dose was administered by another person, not taken by Jackson himself. That part of the story is not in dispute. What the autopsy revealed afterward, though, filled in a picture that the criminal trial only partly captured. More than 50 separate injection sites were found across Jackson's arms, hips, thighs, and shoulders. Not the scattered marks of recreational drug use, but the physical record of a sustained, repeated medical routine. Each one a small notation in a much larger, much longer history written directly onto his body. His lungs showed chronic inflammation of the tissue between the air sacs, a condition that reduces how efficiently oxygen actually moves into the bloodstream, and one that likely explains the fatigue people around him noticed during rehearsals, days when he seemed to be struggling with far more than the physical demands of choreography. A forensic anesthesiologist who reviewed the case for trial testified that this lung condition had already reduced Jackson's respiratory reserve well before propofol entered the picture that final night, leaving almost no margin for the kind of suppression the drug produces even under controlled conditions, and none at all for the way it was given here. He weighed roughly 136 pounds, not the 122 pounds early media reports claimed in the frantic days after his death, when speculation filled space that facts hadn't yet reached. On a frame just over 5 feet 9, 136 pounds is thin. Significantly thin. It reflects weeks of disrupted appetite layered on top of a body that had been spending its nights unconscious rather than resting. No solid food was found in his stomach. Only a small amount of dark fluid and dissolving medication residue. A man preparing to headline 50 sold-out shows at one of the world's most famous arenas was, in the room where he actually lived those final weeks, quietly starving while his production team exchanged emails about contractual deadlines. His heart, by contrast, was found to be structurally sound, an organ that, taken on its own, might have belonged to a perfectly healthy man. It wasn't his heart that failed him. It was everything surrounding it. Roughly 6 weeks before his death, Conrad Murray recorded Jackson on his iPhone, lying in bed, heavily sedated. The recording became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence to come out of the trial. Jackson's voice on it is slurred, drifting in and out of coherence the way speech does under heavy sedation. And yet what he says, despite the fog it's delivered through, is oddly clear in its intent. He talks about children. About wanting to build a hospital for kids who don't have access to care. About wanting to leave something behind that outlasts the music. It is not the performer the world had watched for 4 decades. It's a man barely holding a thought together, describing what he hoped his life would still add up to. Murray testified he made that recording to document how impaired Jackson had become, evidence, he said, meant to convince Jackson later, once he was clear-headed, to accept a different approach to sleep. Many who heard that explanation found it hard to fully accept. Recording a patient at his most vulnerable, without his knowledge or consent, raises questions the trial touched but never resolved. What the recording does confirm, beyond any argument, is timing. Murray had documented, in his own hand, on his own phone, exactly how severe Jackson's impairment already was, 6 weeks before the night that killed him. He had the evidence. He kept the evidence. And the nightly routine continued anyway. Why it continued is a question the manslaughter conviction answers in the narrow language of negligence, without ever really reaching the deeper context surrounding it. That context includes a monthly fee north of $100,000. It includes internal correspondence in which tour executives kept pressing forward despite warnings about Jackson's condition. It includes a simple, uncomfortable arrangement. The one-person position to stop the nightly propofol had financial and professional incentives that made stopping it costly, in ways that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a production schedule. Whatever happened that final morning, the underlying mechanism was, according to the forensic anesthesiologist who testified, almost mechanical in its inevitability. Propofol and the benzodiazepines already circulating in Jackson's system were suppressing his drive to breathe from multiple directions simultaneously. There was no monitor to catch the moment his body stopped compensating. There was no one in the room to notice. That is the forensic truth beneath the legal one. Not a single doctor making one bad decision on one bad night, but a nightly system, running for weeks inside a bedroom stocked with the equipment that acknowledges risk, while missing every safeguard that actually manages it. The oxygen tank was there because on some level, someone understood oxygen might eventually be needed. The pulse oximeter was there because someone understood that oxygen levels might need checking. The equipment that recognizes danger was present the whole time. What was missing was everything that turns recognition into protection. Continuous monitoring, a second trained person in the room, the basic infrastructure that any hospital would require before propofol is ever administered to anyone, let alone repeated, night after night, for weeks. That is the real strangeness at the center of Michael Jackson's final hours. Not the drugs themselves, those were documented, known, unremarkable in the sense that everyone around him understood he was taking them. Not the dependency, that, too, was visible to more people than the public initially realized. The strangeness is the space in between. The precise gap separating what everyone involved understood to be dangerous from what any of them actually did to stop it. Michael Jackson spent his final weeks living inside that gap, night after night, and on the morning of June 25, 2009, his body finally reached the point where the gap closed around him completely. The stage at the Staples Center was still standing that afternoon. The rehearsal notes from the night before were still sitting on the production tables, waiting for a comeback that had, on paper, not yet been cancelled. It would take hours for the people building that tour to understand what had actually happened, and even longer for the full, irreversible weight of it to settle. But inside that bedroom, long before the paramedics ever reached the door, the outcome had already been decided. Not by one bad decision made in a moment of panic, but by weeks of decisions, made quietly, in a room built to acknowledge a danger that no one in it was ever equipped or willing to fully confront. Yet this didn't sway the jury. I am advised that the jury has reached a verdict. We the jury in the above entitled action find the defendant Conrad Robert Murray guilty of the crime of involuntary manslaughter, and the autopsy supports the court's verdict. Conrad Murray failed in his duty as a doctor. Propofol's a very powerful anesthetic. There's a very fine line between its proper effects and causing death in hospital. An anesthesiologist would have the patient attached to numerous machines which would monitor pulse and blood pressure, carbon dioxide levels, and oxygen levels. But investigators found no evidence of any medical monitors in the mansion. Murray was sentenced to 4 years in prison for killing the King of Pop. In a 40-year career, Jackson had established himself as the most successful act of all time. But his success had long been underpinned by reliance on prescription drugs. It was such a tragedy seeing him go from this huge larger-than-life figure down this road of drug dependency. These drugs had turned him into just a shell of his former self. He didn't have a choice. He was around $400 million in debt. It was his make or break comeback. He was on a path of destruction. When you walk off into that devil's den, some of us make it out, some of us don't. Jackson's life had been full of turmoil and controversy. In Conrad Murray, he hired a doctor who ultimately failed him. From the moment they met, Michael's fate was sealed. Michael Jackson was a man with numerous physical and psychological problems, and to overcome these he'd spiraled into drug dependency and addiction. He was using dangerous drugs in an untested manner. In some ways it's a miracle that he lasted as long as he did.